at TV and radio, you often see, and printed media, and on the internet, you often see very ideal pictures of what life is like here. This is probably why lifestyles in developed countries, particularly like Australia, with great senses of sort of equality and a sense of profound democracy, this is why, in many ways, Chinese people probably look at their lifestyles here as almost like their perfect dream. It's an extraordinary thing. We are envied. As just finally coming back to the book The Fat Years, there's something, I guess, which Chen Kungang, the book I referred to at the beginning, there's something that he makes in that book, a point he makes in that book, which I think we need to reflect on finally. He says, and I think when you look at Chinese history from 1949, this is very true, that the greatest challenge and the greatest problem within China has been, and this is his quote, a Chinese writer originally from Hong Kong but now based in Beijing, he said, the Chinese people are intrinsically, profoundly idealistic. This is very strange when you think of the tragic things that have happened since 1949, the great sacrifices that have been made, the huge complexity of Chinese history then. But I think there's a great truth in it. And so I suppose it's a hard thing to say here and now, and probably something that challenges us all. But I suppose for any policymaker here, our greatest challenge is living up to the expectations of Chinese people towards us. Thank you.
The next speaker in our lineup for our panel will be Professor James Avanaticus, and he is a lecturer in the humanities at the University of Western Sydney and a member of the University Institute for Culture and Society. He's also a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Development, and in 2012 he was awarded the prestigious Prime Minister's University Teacher of the Year Award, and he's currently the lead researcher for an Australian research centre, the Discovery Grant, studying the changing nature of citizenship. And his latest book, Contemporary Society, a sociological analysis of everyday life, was launched with the Oxford University Press February 2009, which gave rise to Sociologic on FBI Radio. FBI Radio, that's interesting, 94.5 FM if you want to follow that through. His research areas include hope, trust, political theatre, piracy and citizenship. He has a background in finance and banking before working as a human rights activist throughout the Pacific, Indonesia and Europe. He blogs at www.jamesavanaticus.net. So I'd like you to welcome Professor Avanaticus, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is James. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of this land. I'd also like to thank the Foundation for the invitation and inviting me along. I'm humbled to be on a panel like this. I've known John Ingleson for a number of years, and I think it's the first time we've shared a stage together, John. But I feel like I'm playing. I feel like I'm playing with the big boys now. And after hearing Kerry speak, I'm totally humbled by it. So where to begin? I'll begin by saying I'm a bit of an imposter on this panel. Asia, in the broader sense, is not my research area. I research citizenship, but I do also research what I call resilience, specifically looking at the concept of cultures of resilience. Resilience is an area that's usually looked at by engineers or policymakers. I wonder why some communities, in the face of disaster or massive change, be it environmental disaster or something else, are resilient and survive and thrive, and why others fall apart. And that's my area. And this is taking me in all sorts of places, from Bangladesh to India, from Thailand, as I mentioned, throughout the Pacific, and so on. And so I'll give you my perspective from a much more general view. And I'm going to slightly change what tonight's focus is. And I'm going to do this by not actually changing the topic, but I'm going to put a comma after the word future and the question mark after the word Asia. So the question is Australia's future, comma, in Asia, question mark. That's the question. And the answer is only if we don't stuff it up. And we seem to be doing a damn good job of that at the moment. So, let me begin by a bit of a story. I teach sociology, cultural studies, and I have this. I teach this subject usually about week 5 or 6. Focus is on the nation state, and I'm mainly interested in the social construction of the nation, how it emerges, what the concept is, what are the things that bind us. And socially, I look at a plotted history of Australia. I'll give a plotted history of Australia. And you can imagine, I teach 1,168 students. I do lectures with about 400 to 500 students in them. So there I am in this lecture room. You can imagine this massive lecture room in Parramatta, the outskirts of Sydney. Hundreds of students there, the vast majority of them, say 90% of them, under the age of 30. When I get to the bit where I say, and trying to construct Australia and say, Australia used to be part, or culturally, it used to see itself, or even to see itself as part of Europe, they look at me like I'm joking. And in fact, some of them giggle. And I say, we used to see ourselves as separate from Asia. We used to see ourselves as part of Europe. And they find this incredibly hard to believe. They find this, like I said, unbelievable. They're like, what? And they come to me and they raise all these questions and they ask me about it. They ask me, what were people thinking? And I say, well, the British connections, and I go through it like that. So this question about Australia and Asia, I think, is one that the population, or especially this current generation of emerging leaders, has already made up its mind. The problem is, I think our political class haven't kept up with it. So there are 3 reasons. I want to give you 3 reasons why Australia must be part of Asia, and then I want to give you 5 reasons. I want to give you 5 ways we can do that, and you'll see why my answer was only if we don't stuff it up. So the first one is obviously economic, and I'm sure everyone will cover that. It's been touched on. We're dealing with economic powerhouses all around us, and I think from Indonesia to China, places like Japan or Taiwan, India, and so on, all incredibly powerful economic nations that we need to build closer ties with. The second is the diversity in our heritage, and in Australia, I think the latest figures show that I think something like 40% of Australians have at least one parent born overseas. We're an incredibly diverse culture, and to see ourselves as anything separate from an area which is full of diversity is I think, is that me? No, not good. Okay, is I think social suicide. The third thing is education-wise. Apart from the economic benefits that education, the economic benefits of closer education ties throughout Asia, I think educationally we have a lot to learn from the way that a number of Asian countries approach education. So how do we do this? How can we move forward? How do we remain part of Asia and not stuff it up? I mean, physically we're part of Asia, but how do we continue to build ties? How do we continue to build strength? How do we continue to blossom? And as I said, I'll give 5 reasons. Now, I don't speak. Let me start again. The first one is the question of language and speaking, and our next generation of students learning to speak an Asian language, be it in Bahasa or Mandarin or Cantonese or whichever one. I don't speak a language other than Greek and English. My Greek's okay. In fact, last night at about 11 o'clock I landed from Greece, so if I'm a little bit wayward or not balancing right, that's probably one of the reasons. But there's a word in Greek when you sit down and eat which is equivalent to good appetite or bon appetit, and you say kaliorexi. Now you can translate that word for word, but you can never get the meaning of what that really means to a Greek person. The word rainbow in Greek physically translates to arrow of the sky. There's a very specific meaning in Greek culture and heritage. And there are so many words that can never be translated. And unless we begin to actually embed languages into our schooling system, we're going to continue to be separate from our broader social and cultural neighbours. Now, in saying that, one of the things that we do need to recognise when we say that Australians don't speak an Asian language, is to actually recognise that a significant proportion of students are from Asian backgrounds, second, third, fourth generations. They speak an Asian language. We need to take advantage of that. We need to unleash that power. The second thing I want to talk about, or the second thing we need to do to answer the question of Asia, Australia in Asia, is to look at our politicians and ask our politicians to be more responsible. The most recent federal election, the kicking around of Indonesia and demanding that they accept the votes, the mocking of Malaysia, and so on, I think is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment that was picked up by our neighbours. And I think that we need to recognise that in a globalised world, there's a recognition of domestic policies play out well beyond the domestic sphere and are seen internationally. Thirdly, and picking up on John's point, we need to be leaders in the environmental sphere. For those who have travelled in different parts, you mentioned China. I've spent a lot of time recently in Thailand, India and Bangladesh. For those who spend time there, you see some severe environmental challenges as these nations try and make up dramatically the lost economic time. This is creating environmental havoc, everything from the effects of contributing to climate change to massive clear felling to all sorts of environmental destruction. Australia should be leading the way in working with partners throughout Asian countries in actually looking at these issues. But rather what we're doing is we're turning our back on the environmental challenges that we've actually helped create. Fourthly, the liberal arts. Recently, and one of the things I do when I get to travel in a lot of the countries I've mentioned is I get to teach. It was mentioned before that I got the Prime Minister's Teacher of the Year award. So one of the things I do is I go around these different countries and I give guest lectures, mostly to students. And the response is overwhelming. The desire for a liberal arts education is mind-boggling. And that's not just from students studying the arts, it's from students studying engineering, computer science, and you name it. And the reason he sees is because he's seen to give rise to critical thinking. And critical thinking is what's going to get you to become academically successful and economically successful. Again, unfortunately, what we've actually seen is we've seen a turning away from the liberal arts educations within Australia. And I think this is a tragedy. I'll move on to the fifth one, which is science. And again, one of the questions I think Australia needs to ask itself is, do we just want to be a hole in the ground for Asia? Do we just want to be a big mine? Do we want to be the next Nauru? For those who don't know the story of Nauru, Nauru basically at one point was the most wealthy country in the world. It had per capita more income than any other country. And why? Because of the phosphorus, which actually, talking about a lucky country, right? Had a lot of luck. Phosphorus comes from bird poo, right? It was massively mined, and it was one of the core ingredients to building for farming. And they mined it, and they mined it, and they mined it. And while they were mining it, all the other core skills in the nation needs to survive were left behind. Nauru is now a basket case. Okay? They gave themselves tax cuts, they gave themselves bonuses, they didn't treat the economy properly. It's a basket case. Are we going to be the next Nauru?
Yep.
Yes. That's it. Yeah. And I think the treatment in the last couple of weeks of the CSIRO showed that what we'd rather do is we'd rather make money out of approving mining in the far north of Australia or in other big holes, rather than looking at our education system. Okay? And then someone actually sent me a note the other day, what did the CSIRO do? Like invent Wi-Fi. That's not economically valuable. So, in conclusion, as was mentioned before, my research area is citizenship. And I'm specifically interested in the democratic deficit of our country. All countries really, but I'm specifically interested in young people in the democratic deficit and why young people are turning away from politics. And the answer is quite simple. The answer is that young people aren't turning away from politics. Young people are turning away from the politics as we understand it. Young people are incredibly political. The problem is that the political institutions have not kept up or understand how young people operate politically. They don't understand that an online petition is a real petition. It's dismissed by the vast majority of political parties. The issue with Asia and Australia's involvement with Asia is much the same. Like my students, this question of is Australia's future part of Asia is not a really question. It's been answered. It's a given. It's taken. You spend some time with the students who are dreaming of spending time in Japan or China or Shanghai and so on. That question's answered already. The only problem is, as Claire indicated, our political institutions have not been able to keep up with this. Okay, thank you.
Third speaker in the forum is Professor John Ingleson. John Ingleson is an Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales and the University of Western Sydney. He's a graduate of the University of Western Australia and from Monash, where he obtained his PhD in 1974. He has been Professor of History, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of New South Wales before joining UWS as Deputy Vice-Chancellor in 2007. He retired in September 2011 to once again take up the life of a scholar. Professor Ingleson is currently completing a book tentatively titled Workers' Unions and Politics, Indonesian Labour Unions in the 1930s. I'd like you to welcome Professor John Ingleson, please.
I assure you there is life after formal retirement. The book's now finished. It's coming out in January, and it's been 2 years and 25 years, I think. I speak a lot about Australia and Asia. I've done it professionally for 25 years or so, maybe 35 years. A lot to Australian companies over the years, and I won't regale you with some of the horror stories, but I've always been an optimist, and I've always taken the view that if you take the optimistic view, and we really have, in the end, Australia has no choice but to see itself as part of Asia and to take advantages of it and to work with the countries in Asia. But while I'm an optimist about Australia's future in Asia, I'm also a realistic optimist. I recognise, in a way that I think a lot of people don't, particularly the political and the business leaders of this country, both, and I'll come back to both because I think both groups are a problem. I recognise that we have a great deal of work to do in Australia if we are going to prosper in the next few decades, and I worry sometimes about the future for my own kids. I want to talk tonight about some of the complacency and the rhetoric which has come to define this whole concept of Australia in Asia. And I'll talk about two issues. Firstly, the Australia in the Asia Century White Paper, and secondly, Australia's relationships with its nearest Asian neighbour, Indonesia. And I did think about the second one before the events of the last few days. I am a specialist in Indonesia. I know Indonesia well. Let me look first of all Australia in the Asia Century. Many of you will have seen the report produced by Ken Henry. It came out as a white paper.